everybody. Christian Bradley for the Game Institute. We're back. It's like we were just here. Just yesterday we were here. A word of warning, the label I picked for this video was not very descriptive. I put these together yesterday and I'm not sure what I was thinking with this one, but I called it exploding Photoshop layers, exploring Photoshop layers, which isn't really what it was supposed to be called. We actually already covered that. I think I probably double posted this one. But this one was supposed to be about Photoshop. And so what we're going to be talking about are textures in Photoshop. Layers are involved, if you want to look at it that way. But yeah, we already covered layers. We did it, I think the beginning of last week we did the layers one. So sorry about that. It happens. So today we're going to be talking about textures in Photoshop, and I need to find my files here. Okay, drag this one out here. We'll take a look at this first. So this is more of a teaching demo. And what I wanted to do is go over the different types of textures, if you want to call it that, and different ways that textures are applied to objects in either a game engine or in your 3D modeling program. So clicking to get everything open here. If you want to call it that. There we go. Need to be able to see YouTube. Also, we're in a lot of places. We got YouTube. We've got Game Institute. I got to have a streaming program open on my screen. Okay, so this texture here, which was done long ago, I think this was done for a PlayStation 2 game, long time ago, is a hand-painted texture. And what we used to do, you don't see this a lot, but you still see it in stylized games, in app-based games, smartphone games, is we used to have to recreate a texture essentially from scratch. We would have digital photographs or scans like a scanner would do, 2D scan, to place the different materials together and create a texture. So you can think of it as kind of like wallpaper that just went on a blank wall, like a great big picture, and it would go on that wall. A couple things about these types of textures. They had their perceived depth built into them. So we would paint shadows, for instance. These rounded bamboo poles would have to be created to look round. The different materials would need to look like they had a tactile texture to them. So it was very much like painting would be, like traditional painting. You had to make the object look like it had depth. Now, there's all sorts of reasons this went away. Lots of reasons. I guess instead of saying why it went away, we'll start with the why we did it that way at one time. The main reason was everything had to be so low poly in the game environment. And we're talking about, boy, it wasn't even that long ago. We're probably talking 10 years ago, 12 years ago, right around that range. So PlayStation 2 era, yeah, GameCube, PlayStation 2. We didn't have the polygon counts to do any real modeling of fine detail in the game program. We really didn't even have game engines back there then. They were something different. So we had to recreate it all. Also, there was no real-time lighting. So even if we could get the kind of detail that we're used to today, the lighting wasn't good enough in the game to really show it off, so it was kind of a waste. Plus, you throw in lots of polygons and lighting. Well, you couldn't do that. You could kind of get away with maybe one or the other, but you really couldn't do both. For instance, cast shadows were something that you probably weren't going to see a lot of back in the PlayStation 2 era. So texture artists would sit around all day, and just like painters might do today, they recreated these surfaces. And you had to know a little bit about modeling and so forth to apply these. But let's talk about how they were applied. We also didn't have, again, for the most part, UV unwrapping tools. The ability to specifically place images on a model. We had projection mapping, but not UV mapping. And I'll real quickly, this will test my tablet drivers. That'll be fun. Let's see if those old tablet drivers have held up here in Windows 10. Just a second. Whoops. Just a second. As I rip things out of the computer here. Get hooked up here. It sounds like those drivers were on. It gave me a happy little beeping noise there. Alright. Can I go all the way over here? Yeah. My tablet's not set up perfect here, so this may be a little rocky. But if we had an unwrapping program, I gotta get a better angle here to draw. What's going on there? My I can't draw a sphere for the life of me. My tablet, I think my tablet's all stretched out. Just a second. It's the first time I've used the tablet since I reset Windows. I'll get it. Tablet, properties, preferences. No, not preferences, properties. I'll get it. Here we go. Mapping. Oh, that's the problem. My mapping is all over the place here. Almost there. You guys that have watched before know my issues with Wacom tablet drivers. We've got them fixed, but now my mapping's all off here. Okay, I think that's probably going to be okay. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so what would happen? Now I got Photoshop. The problem I keep running into is I got Photoshop showing on my second screen, but my settings are on my first screen. I didn't think of that when I set up this thing here. Okay, if I had a sphere, so let's say that's a sphere. That is a horrible sphere. I can do better than that. I'll cheat. So I have a sphere. There you go. Now we have a sphere. And I wanted to map it. When we just had planar mapping, I've got a weird setup. There we go. With planar mapping, it's as if your mapping is being shined through a great big plane that's kind of hovering above the sphere. So think of it as a big piece of shrink wrap or plexiglass kind of hanging over the sphere. And the mapping can only map through that plane. So for something like a sphere, it became really hard to map something, because you just get all this stretching that would go on along these lines. Now, in the case of something like a unwrapped sphere, what we can do is chop the sphere up into little parts. So say right along this line, chop it in half, and chop it in half along this line in our 3D modeling program. And then each of those parts gets spread out on a map. So you might end up with, say, 6 kind of flat pieces, which is a lot better than what we used to have. With unwrapping, we have pretty much complete control over how our textures lay on our models. But that changed the whole way that we had to, well, not only model, but unwrap the objects or map the objects, and it changed the way that the maps looked. So now, instead of something like this, that was kind of like a painting that would just be put on a wall, we ended up with with small, slight delay. Come on. There we go. We ended up more like this type of object, or this type of texture, which are called generics, where they still have some essence of a tactile nature to them, but nowhere near as much. So no cast shadows, no self shadows. Any depth is shown by maybe color changes, but not shadows. Maybe sometimes ambient shadows or ambient occlusion, but for the most part, no shadows. And this generic texture would then tile. So you could put this texture on a large wall and it would tile all the way across the wall, and you wouldn't be able to see the seams if you did it right. Now, for a long time, these were still hand painted. There was a long stretch of time there where we had to do these massive textures with lots of different normal maps with only Photoshop. We might have things like the NVIDIA tools to help with normal maps or some third-party tools, but we didn't have Quixel, Substance, those types of materials. And we couldn't use the shaders in the 3D programs because those languages aren't going to translate over to the game engines. So we got away for many years, probably 5-6 years, doing these types of maps, which were generic, large maps. And then we would place those on our model and unwrap them. Maybe you'd do some hand painting. That came along shortly after to blend the materials together, but for the most part we had these generic materials. Now, there was another way of doing things at the same time, and this is an example of one. And you might be looking at that thinking it looks kind of kooky. It's hard to tell what's really going on. And this is a texture that's built to the grid. It's a texture that can be used on many different objects at one time. And I don't think my grid settings are set exactly right, but let's check here. So if I say show grid, and it's going to be hard to see because my grid is not the greatest coloring. But if each of these here, let's do this. Get this so you can see it. I'm just going to put a dark layer over the top of it so you can see the grid right now is all. I'll remove that in a second. If each of these little squares was the equivalent of, say, a power of 2, say 16. So if we set up our grid here, let's do that. Let's go to Preferences, Grids, and Custom Style Lines, Grid Line every one. Right now it's in inches. Let's go to Pixels, and we don't want grid line every 1 pixel. We want a grid line every, what would be good, 16? 16 might work for this. And we'll just put 1 subdivision. 2, 3, 4. Yeah, that sort of works. It's not the best. Well, this texture doesn't line up. I'm not sure. I grabbed it out of a group that should line up, but it doesn't line up great. But along all these grid lines, you'll see those lines on the texture are going to line up. See at the bottom of that curve, that whole piece fills up this group of squares here. This trim piece right here fits in here. And that's so that we could use different parts of the texture, like this trim piece up here, anywhere in our scene. And it really took some thinking to build textures to the grid. Fortunately, it wasn't a phase that lasted real long. But it still shows up sometimes. A few app games, especially like 3D app games, you'll see this type of thing because the texture space is so limited. All right. Then along started coming some software that could really help us. So we started being able to take something like this texture here and convert it over to a normal map. And what a normal map did is it made that texture appear to have some depth or be bumpy, have a tactile surface to it. Nowadays, we kind of take normal maps for granted, like they were always around, but they haven't been around a real long time. It's only been about the last 2 iterations of consoles that we've seen normal maps, but it made all the difference in the world. Because now, if you got normal maps, you don't need that ambient occlusion. You don't need cast shadows. You don't need to do much in your color map except just add color. And the bumpiness is going to come from your normal map. The self-shadowing is going to come from your normal map. And then we started getting into fancier maps we'll mention in a second. Now, a normal map we've dealt with quite a bit already. Here's another one. Probably a little simpler to deal with. Normal maps are pretty easy to understand. The blue is height. So think of the blue as how high these surfaces are. And if you're wondering why it's always the same blue, it's because normal maps, it doesn't really matter about the height. It matters about how big the depth is of the bevel. That's what actually makes it look higher or lower. The z-axis is pretty much always this blue color, unless it's a curved surface like a car or something. And that's because if you look straight down at something, imagine, I don't know, a book or something that has some depth to it, and you put it on the table and look straight at it, you can't tell what the depth is. Everything is on the same plane when you're looking straight at it. And that's kind of how a normal map works. That's why you get a lot of the blue. The blue is the z-axis. The green and the red, or the pink, those are the x and y axes. And you get this dark green and purple-ish colors because that's the negative y and x axes. And the way those guys work is as light is calculated to simulate hitting the surface in a game, anything that's blue basically doesn't change. Anything that's green and pink and dark green and purple, then it changes so that it appears to be bumpy. Reason we like that is it doesn't take really any extra polygons to run it. Normal maps, because there's so few colors in them relative to other maps, are usually really small. They're nothing more than an image. It's just they're a very simple image. And the load time that it takes to load the extra map for every model is easily solved by faster processing power, better equipment, that type of thing that came along at the same time. So we essentially ended up with normal maps pretty much for free because technology got faster and faster, and it allowed us to bring in normal maps and really just make similar games to what we were making, but make them look a whole lot better. Well, normal maps have stuck around for a really long time. Boy, I don't think I've worked on anything that hasn't had normal maps involved with it for probably 6, 7, maybe 8 years. But then we started inheriting all sorts of these other crazy maps. And these guys came along as game engines got better and better with lighting and calculating how light interacted with the objects in the maps. So by the time you get to today, you end up having to create somewhere between 3 and like 8 maps per object, depending on what type of game you're trying to make. And those guys can look very different than they used to. This is an albedo map, and it's a skin. So what you're looking at is the unwrapped skin of a model. In this case, it's a cannon. So everywhere that's wood, those polygons on the model have been tagged to accept wood. Anywhere that you see the metal, those polygons have been told you need to sit in this spot. And it's kind of like you're cutting out fabric to put together a pair of jeans, but some parts of the jeans are different colors or different fabrics, so you cut them out of different materials. Unwrapping takes a while to learn how to do. I find it's one of the harder things for students to actually learn when they start. It's certainly not hard once you get used to it. But the maps look very different too, so it throws students. Here's an AO map, and if you're wondering, well, what's going on with that mess, that's the self-shadowing and cavities of the model. So imagine a cannon that's been taken apart and all the parts have been placed on the ground in a square. Well, that's kind of what it would look like. And if you take this map and paste it on top of this map, and we're just going to change the fill here, you'll see that those parts all stick within those different materials. So here's the cannon part, all metal. Here's the wheels, they're wood. This is other wood parts of the cannon. This is other steel parts of the cannon. All right, here's another map. This is called an ID map. An ID map is nothing more than colors that are placed on the surfaces that require different materials. So in this case, everything that's yellow is going to be counted as metal. Now the reason we do that is we quickly got away from just color maps, and normal maps and specular maps were around at the same time. And we started using lots of other types of maps, so now it became necessary to tag different parts of the same image. This is all one image, obviously, but it has metal, wood, I don't know what this is, we'll call it steel, up here, and all of those have different properties as far as how the shader interacts with light. And so the ID map breaks up this image into smaller and smaller chunks that your game engine then can identify. So it might say this part's really shiny, this part's not so shiny. Here's the metallic map, which would work on top of your, well, all the maps at this point would work together. But if we put this on top of our ID map and we lower the fill, you'll see that certain parts there are going to be shiny, the white parts. The black parts are not shiny. Kind of interesting how those work. This is our normal map for our cannon. You'll see it's pretty much just wood. Now the reason we don't see a lot of details in this is most of the details in this model were built into the model, not the normal map. So here we're just seeing some bumpy surfaces for metal and some surfaces for the wood. It's not a very exciting normal map. And here's our roughness map. And the roughness map tells us how much surface scattering is going on the model to make it look rough. If something's rough, it has kind of a micro surface bumpiness to it. Well, that's what's being simulated here. And if something is really bumpy, like a micro surface bumpy, so think like sandpaper, it can't be overly shiny because the surface is scattering the light when the light hits it, and not much of that light is going to hit your eye, causing a highlight. It's going to be a very dull highlight, or no highlight at all, because the light gets scattered from the small bumps. All that stuff now, we just get to be lucky enough that we can simulate in textures. You can see the problem, though, that we created for ourselves. If you, well, you can call it a problem or not. Depends on where you're coming from. But we created a whole bunch of different maps that now the texture artist had to create. Some of them are relatively easy. Some were pretty complicated. Something like a normal map, you might have to have a high poly object just to bake the normal maps from. So the entire process got pretty complicated. Well, then you see programs like Substance Painter and Quixel that popped on the scene and made things much easier. I'm going to start up Quixel here just so you can see what it looks like if you haven't seen it. I'm not going to do much in Quixel here. But this is Quixel. It's actually a separate program that runs within Photoshop. And I think I've got a model loaded here. Yep. Nope. Sorry. And this is 3DO, which is the viewer that comes with it. By the way, look at that. I can click over here. It doesn't disappear anymore. Isn't that exciting for those that have been watching for a long time? And I can go to, say, Dedo. And what Dedo will do is generate some of these maps for me based off of material that I give it. Well, I have to activate mine because I just upgraded to the newest one. But here's what Quixel looks like. I'll activate this after the video. They just came out with the new version of Quixel today, so if you have Quixel, you'll get a little notice to upgrade. And you can see here I can click in these little areas and add maps that I already have, and then I'd click down here and it would make more maps for me using these maps as a base. So it's a nifty little tool. Endu would then create normal maps for me. Again, with the activation license, sorry. I don't want to do that live, but it'll create normal maps for me. So Quixel was a pretty neat little program. Substance Painter has also come on the market, and Substance Painter is probably a little bit more complex, but it'll do a little bit more for you than Quixel. So all sorts of different map types that we have made for ourselves. So that's kind of our brief tour through the world of texture maps. Hope that explains some things. I know we kind of throw the terms around like skins, texture maps, build to the grid, all those types of things when they may not make any sense. So that will do it for today, folks. Let me check and make sure there are no questions. It does not look like there are questions. Okay. See y'all later. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.